Right with you in just a minute. Right. Good evening, everybody. As promised, and in recognition of Black History Month, thought we would have a live conversation and talk about some of the quotes that we've already put up, which have had phenomenal responses. Um, Mostly good, some um, not so flattering, but mostly good. And so we appreciate that. Now, listen, we exist not so that, and we being the Freedom and Justice Institute, we exist as a tool for learning, hopefully a platform to have a conversation about what's relevant. Now, you may think, well, if we're having a conversation about what's current and what's relevant, why are we talking about Malcolm X, who's been dead for almost 60 years? Well, the short of it is this, friends. I'm a student of history. By the way, let me introduce myself. I think that's appropriate at this point. If you tuned in and you've seen some of our commentary, then you may wonder, well, who is this guy? I think that's a fair question. Why should we listen to him? Well, maybe at the end of the day, the decision that you reach is that maybe you shouldn't listen to me. But let's see if I can give you some information so you can make an informed decision about, why maybe this would be a place to spend a little bit of your time. My name is Jerry Gurley, Girley, if you want to spell that out. If you want to look me up further, I live in the Orlando, Florida area. I am primarily a civil rights attorney, but I'm also, in my mind, to my thinking, more importantly, I am a minister of the gospel. Sometimes people greet me in my community as Attorney Gurley. Sometimes they greet me as Pastor Gurley. The common thread between those two things that I do is serving the community. Part of the serving of the community involves spiritually uplifting. I think that's foundational, right? In my worldview, the lens through which I see everything is spiritual primarily, and then secondarily, of course, I'm a student of history. I am an observer of politics. But I look at life through all of these lenses, and I see that for us, there's such a limited amount of information. Those who want to know the truth, those who come from historically marginalized and historically oppressed communities, there's just such a dearth. And when I say dearth, I'm not trying to use big words, but what I mean is a scarcity of quality information, quality conversation, reasoned conversation, in-depth conversation about the things that matter. A lot of times when we Black people are talking about the issues, it's because things are happening to us. And indeed, things are happening to us right now. As I perceive it, there's an attack on Black progress, Black empowerment, Black anything, by the structure, by the system. And the reason why, there are two reasons why we're going to discuss Malcolm X tonight. One is that he made some comments. In fact, this year would have been his 100th birthday in May 19th. He was born at May 19th, 1925. So this is the 100th year of his birthday. But his comments, some of them, not all of them, in my view, are very relevant to the issues of this day. And one of the reasons why they're relevant, and we'll talk about that, and I invite you to give me your comments and your questions. You don't have to agree with me. This is a space for conversations, for meaningful conversations. The only thing that I ask that you do when you offer up your comments is that you be respectful. And if I'm responding to someone else's comments, please also respect their comments. If you're disrespectful, we will make sure that your comments are not heard or removed from the platform. Otherwise, We want to hear what you have to say. Getting back to Malcolm, the reason why it's important that we talk about Malcolm, in addition to the fact that we're celebrating his 100th birthday, a lot of times some of the Black people from the past that are put forth as individuals that we should celebrate, people like Frederick Douglass, which I think we should celebrate. He was on the cutting edge of standing up for Black people in speaking truth to power. He was back then what was referred to as an abolitionist. And an abolitionist was a forerunner of what we would think of as a civil rights advocate, civil rights leader. Of course, we know Dr. King, and occasionally we talk about George Washington Carver. We talk about W. Du Bois, and the preeminent intellectual, the first Black man to get a doctoral degree from Harvard University. All of these individuals are very impressive. They've moved the needle in many respects and are deserving of our respect, adoration, admiration. But people like Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X, who also in their own ways moved the needle, spoke to the questions of their day, which in a cyclical fashion have become the questions of our day, around the topic of inclusion, around the topic of justice. So now tonight, we're going to dive in and look at some of the quotes that we've been discussing on TikTok, on YouTube, and other platforms, and we'll discuss here tonight. If you've got questions or comments and you want to tune in, let me know. But why Malcolm's comments are relevant today, some of them, again, as I say, not all of them, is because oppression, and when I talk, I'm going to switch between disciplines. What disciplines? Religious discipline, legal discipline, just as a student of history. So I'm going to jump between those different subject areas, hopefully seamlessly. But now I'm going into the spiritual side of things, because I think that it helps explain a political phenomena that we can clearly see is going on. And that is what I refer to, and I have referred to in prior lectures, as the cycle of oppression. Folks, if you are 40 years or older, and maybe you're not, and then if you're not, you're going to learn something hopefully historically today, or maybe you read it. But if you're 40 years or older, let's say 50, you knew about the 1980s. In the 1980s, the attack on Black progress was couched in terms of reverse discrimination, where the white majority, members of the white majority, and let me say not all of them, right? But those who were committed, those who were focused around what is often referred to as conservative principles, conservative thoughts, conservative ideas, very cleverly, and I would even say adeptly, put the civil rights movement on its heels by attacking it and saying that it went too far. And at that point, it was now causing injury to innocent white people. Now, let me say quickly that was just not true. But what they did do is talk about their issues in a way that was effective, that made the uninformed, the uneducated, the non-curious. When I say non-curious, I mean the people who are not willing to do the independent verification on their own. It made them believe that Black people were benefiting at the expense of poor, innocent white people, and hence the term reverse discrimination. Now, as a civil rights attorney, I will tell you there's no such thing as reverse discrimination. I believe that white people can be discriminated against. As a lawyer, as a civil rights attorney, I represent Black people, white people, people from Asia, people from Africa, people from the good old USA, people from Mississippi, people from New York, people from Los Angeles, California. I think all people who are in power can abuse their power. I think that that's a function of human nature. And if I'm crossing over to the discipline, the religious discipline, I'm talking about the fact that there's something about human beings and our quote unquote fallen nature that sometimes we abuse power when we have it, and we don't use it properly. There's a saying that power corrupts absolutely, and absolute power corrupts. And so whoever's in power, they're always in danger of if they're not being insightful, if they're not being spiritual, if they're not rooted and grounded in a system of truth that's not a floating system. Because one of our challenges that we have in this country today is that our mores, our values are rapidly evaporating. Truth is relative to whatever the current people in power want to say it is. And that's always a recipe for disaster, societal disaster, when there are no fixed values, no fixed mores. But anyway, so there is no such thing as reverse discrimination. But in the 1980s, the notion of reverse discrimination of preferences was very adeptly articulated by conservatives whose goals were actually to undermine civil rights laws and policies and procedures. And that was spearheaded by the Reagan administration, the Reagan Revolution. To some people, to conservatives, he was in many respects the second coming of Jesus. He walked on water. He could do no wrong. But in my community, in my place where I actually grew up, which is Long Beach, California, Reagan was the governor of California when I was a small child. And I remember my parents saying when, at that time, Governor Reagan was running for president, if he ever became the president of the United States, it's going to be rough for Black people. And that was not hyperbolic language, because in fact, when Reagan became the president, one of the things he began to do is to try to unravel some of the rights that Black people had gained in the previous 25, 30 years. One significant thing that Ronald Reagan did, and I'm saying all of this because I'm trying to get to a larger point, which is that things happen and then they rehappen. We make progress, so we think, and then we go down the road 10, 15, 25, 30 years, and we're having to fight the same battles, right? Over and over again. Now, that's what I refer to as the cycle of oppression. And the Bible, now I'm speaking as a minister, doesn't speak about discrimination, right? It doesn't say, woe to those who discriminate. But the Bible does speak about oppression. It has a lot to say about oppression. And it has nothing good to say about oppression. God hates oppression. God will judge and has judged entire nations because of the fact that they oppress the widows, and they oppressed the stranger, which in our language today we refer to as the immigrant and or the minority, because they oppressed the fatherless. Now these groups, if you the widow, the stranger, the alien, the fatherless, they are mentioned at different points together, beginning in the Old Testament when Moses is articulating the law. There's provisions and protections put into place for these people. Then there are times when they're mentioned again in the prophets, when God is explaining to his people why he is handing down judgment and punishment, why he is not blessing them. He talks about how the widows, how the fatherless, how the poor, how the strangers are being oppressed. So there's a lot that Christians in this country want to talk about. And let me say this, and I welcome any pushback that you would like to offer, but in the white nationalist Christian system, there are some pet peeves that they have, right? There's some issues that they want to talk about, abortion being number one, and perhaps same-sex relationships number two, and perhaps beyond that, number three would be pornography. But in their worldview, these are the only things that God is concerned about. But the reality is the Bible has a whole lot to say about a whole lot of different things. And I'm still getting to Brother Malcolm, so you all have to bear with me. I'm just laying the foundation as to why what Malcolm said, 60 years ago is coming back to speak to us right on point today. And the reason for that is the stuff that undergirded the policies that Black people were contending against 60 years ago, 100 years ago. Even though we cut the weeds down at the surface, we didn't deal with the root of the matter. We didn't deal with the heart of the matter, because the fact is secular law is inept. It is incompetent to deal with the heart of the matter, which is a darkened soul, which is a soul and a society that is predicated on the accumulation of wealth at the expense of everything else. And that includes human lives. If human lives have to be broken, if human lives have to be destroyed, if religious ethics have to be jettisoned, if mores and values have to be ignored, twisted, and contorted so that we can make money. See, that's the structure, that's the system that we're operating within. And laws can't change that. It can control it. I want you, when you think about the law, I want you to think about it in this way. The law sets the floor. In other words, it sets the minimum in terms of how human beings should treat each other, but it doesn't control the ceiling. Philosophy, ideology, spirituality sets the ceiling. And that's important, because part of what we will talk about, if you will chat with me from time to time and come and sit with me in these fireside conversations that hopefully we will have periodically. If you will chat with me and sit with me, we'll talk about higher principles and higher truths. When I posted this restatements about Malcolm, several of you said to me, well, okay, so what do we do now? It's right what he said. So what's the next step? Well, we have to ascend to higher ground. Sometimes when you're in the valley, and of course I'm speaking metaphorically, and you're in the heat of the battle, you lack perspective. You can't really see how the battle is going. You can't see where the enemy is approaching. You can't see where your strengths lie. You can't see where your enemy's weakness lie. So metaphorically, and spiritually, now this is Pastor Gurley talking to you, Reverend Gurley, Brother Gurley. We have to ascend to higher ground first so we can get some perspective. One of the things that we brought here as Africans and as we continue to walk in as descendants of people from Africa is spirituality. Now, in our home continent, and by the way, Africa is the continent, anthropologists and archaeologists and genetic scientists all agree that Africa is the cradle of, the continent of Africa is the cradle of all human beings. So we are all Africans. Some of us, our ancestors left that great continent more recently than others, but we are all Africans. But when we left under horrible conditions as slaves, as property, as chattel slaves, one thing that we took with us, interestingly, is some of our food, literally, like seeds from okra, and the women put them in their hair. Seeds from melons and yams and things of that nature. We brought our food with us, and we brought our faith. And going forward, as we try to craft a response to what's happening, there's something happening to us right now. We're seeing a resurgence of stuff that we had dealt with, that we thought we put to bed. And I'm going to quote Thomas Jefferson now. I don't quote him that often. But one thing that Thomas Jefferson said that I think is powerful and relevant, and that is that the cost of freedom is eternal vigilance. There's never a time then that we can't stop watching for the re-encroachment and the reimagination and the repackaging of the enemy's plan, the opponent's plan, which is to oppress us, to dehumanize us through various means, to dummy us down so that we may be exploited, so that a few can make a lot of money. Slavery was about money. Segregation was about money. Convict leasing, which is not taught at all in public school settings for the most part. And that's when Black people were arrested after slavery in mass and charged with various different frivolous laws, vagrancy laws, and fined a heavy fine that they couldn't pay, and then therefore leased out to farmers, to former slave masters, to work off their debt for months and sometimes for years. That whole system went on for another 100 years after slavery. Not many people even know that. The point is, there have been, throughout our existence, our time in the Western Hemisphere, the system, because I need to be very careful about that. I know that there's never been a time when all white people in North America, in Europe, or any other place on the globe have agreed with this and embraced this and thought that it was right and proper. In fact, you had the Quakers very early on resisting this, opposing this. And they were the original abolitionists. And there were other insightful, spiritual, honest, decent white people who resisted slavery. But the system, the white system of oppression that came out of Europe and who met in Berlin in 1898, I believe it was, and carved up the different parts of Africa. And that system, that European white system of dominance, it has never really completely gone away, right? And so it has learned to reinvent itself. It has learned to leave the main stage and to hide behind the curtains and to call out the lines to the actors who are on stage. But it's always been there. I think at times we've hoped and wished that it was gone. But hoping and wishing, as much of a man of faith that I am, and faith is my foundation, hoping and wishing is not a plan. It's not a strategy. Someone asked me a question regarding these Malcolm posts. What are we going to do? Well, my statement is we need to ascend to higher ground. We need to have some time where we reflect, some time where we are introspective before we get into a reactionary mode. And I'm for marching, I'm for picketing, I'm for protesting. I have done all the above. I'm doing some of it right now in response to some of these corporate giants who have made lots of money, millions and maybe trillions of dollars at our expense, who are turning their backs on our basic human rights to be treated fair and equal. You know, it's not that they have to give us equality. If you've seen some of my posts, to be human means that you are equal. That is part and parcel. That is inherent with being a human being. The reason why slavery and segregation and Jim Crow existed is because one set of human beings refused to respect the humanity of another set of human beings. So the struggle is not about gaining equality. It's about perhaps maybe regaining it, or making sure that our our white brothers and sisters, the white system that I'm talking about, the system of oppression, the system of using science to justify their superior position in the world, using religion to control people of color, to get them in a passive, docile state so that they believe that one day, as we say in the Black church, in that great getting up morning, when the chariot swings low and the waters of Jordan are parted, we're going to go home and we're going to celebrate. And I'm looking for all of the above. And I'm not being facetious. But the Bible and God has a lot to say about what happens right now. And a lot to say about oppression. Why am I using that term, oppression? Because really, as I said, the discrimination is a relatively new term that we use in the world, but oppression is ancient, and it is universally recognized as something that should not exist. And there are many scriptures that address how God feels about it. And interestingly, if you have some biblical literacy, you would know about the prophet Isaiah chapter 58 and 59, where God is having an interactive conversation with his people, and they're confused. They are trying to find out why their prayers aren't being answered, and God tells them in chapter 59, verse 1, my hand is not shortened and my ears aren't dull. It's your sins that have separated you, that has created a wall between you and me. And then from there, moving forward to the other verses, he begins to lay out the wrongs that they've done. But one of the things, interestingly, that he lays out is that none call for justice. Typically, with my white brothers and sisters, evangelical brothers and sisters, and my Black brothers and sisters who are entrenched in the white evangelical movement, that the call for justice is quote unquote political. We shouldn't be concerned about political things. We should be concerned about spiritual things, which they reduce to three topics: abortion, same-sex relationships, and pornography. And the Bible really doesn't say anything at all about abortion. You will not find that word in the Bible, period. But you will find oppression. And you will also find in many places the word justice. But in the book of Isaiah, the prophet tells the people something that they may have found to be startling. What he says is none call for justice, and he characterizes that as a wrong, meaning this, and I'm now speaking as a lawyer. It's not, sometimes we run afoul with God, not because of what we did, but sometimes we can run afoul of God because of what we didn't do. And if you are a believer, if you're a person of faith, if you are a spiritual person, if you're someone who's trying to do what is right, part of your duty as a decent human being, and certainly as a man of God or a woman of God, a Christian or a follower of Allah, maybe a Buddhist, whatever your faith system is, part of your affirmative duty to keep harmony in the world, to ensure that God's blessings and protection and favor upon you and your people and your society, is that when you see injustice, you have to call it out. That's what Isaiah said in the 59th chapter of his book. If you don't believe it, read it, please. I encourage you. For those of you who are inclined. If you're not, biblically or religiously inclined, fine. You're welcome in this conversation in this space, because this is hopefully a conversation about what we have to do to lift ourselves. Let me give you a Malcolm quote that we already put out there, or if we haven't, we will put it out there. Malcolm said, "You can't beg other people for your freedom. And you can't look to your opponent to, and I'm paraphrasing, freedom is not something that other people do for you. It's something that you do for yourself. So if we're going to be free, Brother Malcolm tells us that we have to look inside of ourselves. We have to, if we say that we're free, and we are free in the sense of our God-given status, if we say that we are equal, and we are equal, we are as much human, and therefore as much deserving of everything that anyone else on planet Earth is deserving of. If we say that we are not their intellectual inferiors, if we say that they're not our intellectual that part of the white oppressive structure, which I've said, that doesn't include every white person. Similarly, every Black person is not a part of the group of people who are trying to fight for the uplift of Black people. There are some Black people who don't even identify themselves as Black, don't want to be called Black, offended when you call them African American or whatever, because they have made up in their minds that they want to associate with privilege. And privilege, let's face it, whether we like it or not, the objective reality is the people who have the power in this country being the United States of America, the people who have the privilege in the United Kingdom, the people who have the privilege in Canada are white. And from the time of slavery, from the time of colonialism until this very hour, they have been in power because they took that which was not theirs. They exploited bodies, Black and brown bodies. And someone said to me, by the way, when you speak about Black causes, why do you speak about brown people? Why can't you just stay on the Black cause? Well, Malcolm X, if he could speak, and we're talking about Malcolm, we're elevating Malcolm and his thoughts and how they might apply to what we are dealing with, what we see politically, socially, and economically today. Malcolm told the story that once upon a time, a white female came to him after one of his speeches and said, "I was so impressed. I just want to see what I can do to be a part of the solution. What can I do to help?" And what he said to her, because she was white, because he was a member of the Nation of Islam, and they taught that all white people were devils, literally. He said, "You can't do anything for me." He had a sense that in the Nation of Islam then, I don't know much about what they're teaching today, but certainly at that time, they taught that Black people needed to be exclusive unto themselves, rely on themselves. Self-reliance is still very much applicable. I think that they were on point there, but to the point where it translated and sounded like hating other people, I think that was wrong-headed. I think that hate is corrosive, and it is a diversion of necessary emotional energy. We can't hate anyone for any reason because it's too costly to us. As human beings, we are limited in our time and our resources, in our energy, and our just all the way around. And so we've got to devote our emotional energy to loving ourselves, not hating people who are opposing us. We can hate the system, we can hate the structure, we can hate the tactics, the dubious tactics of calling good evil and evil good, which is what I think, when they used the term reverse discrimination going back to the 1980s, they were cleverly calling good evil and evil good. Today, when they attack DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's the same spirit. It's the same strategy with a different face on it. It's the same monster that it was in the 1980s. But let me tell you something else. And for those of you who are inclined to do research, those of you who are scholars, those of you who are curious, those of you who are students of history, those of you who want to get a broader historical perspective as it relates to race in the United States of America, I would encourage you to read the Supreme Court opinion in a series of cases that came out in a decision that was made in 1883. That's 1883, not 1983, 1883. So the civil rights cases. And let me talk about how the civil rights cases came about in 1883. At that time, Black people had just come out of slavery, as you know, and we've gone through a period that is called the Reconstruction era, right? So when Black people were initially freed, the white Southerners said, well, you're free, but you're not really free. Well, the 13th Amendment was, passed or ratified to clear it up, that slavery in no form or shape would exist, with the exception of if you were convicted of a crime, then you could be subjected to forced servitude, involuntary servitude. So the Southern states start passing all these crazy laws, vagrancy laws, and then convicting Black people of things like not being gainfully employed by a white person, gathering in a public square without the permission of a white person. And then because they couldn't pay the fines, this is where convict leasing. And in return, when you were arrested and convicted of that bogus and dubious crime, your former master could come to the courthouse and he would have first dibs on bidding to pay your fine. And when he paid your fine, you had to go back to the plantation and work off your debt. Now, that's some wacky, crazy, terrible, horrible stuff. But that happened, and we don't teach that in American history. I want you to look up convict leasing students. But let's get to 1883, how we got to the 1883 civil rights cases. Well, then Black people said, well, now we's free, so we get to vote, and we get to have the right to, which is something that is part and parcel of being a human being. And every human being and every group of people around the globe, this is the indicia, this is the indicator that you are truly free when you have the right to self-determination. And part of how we get to self-determination is that we have the right to the franchise, which is to say the right to vote, right? So Black people begin to try to vote in the South, and white people say, you're not citizens. Just because you're a citizen of the United States don't mean that you're a citizen of our state, or that you're a citizen, period. And so then at that time, the Republican Congress, which was actually the liberals in Congress, if you can believe it or not, put forth another amendment to the United States Constitution, which was the 14th Amendment. And it talks about the fact that everyone that was born in the United States, regardless of whether their parents were slaves, they are citizens, right? And now that's important because, well, that the 14th Amendment was ratified in the 1860s, and now we have President Donald Trump, and he's attacking the very core of that constitutional amendment. White people then were finding ways to attack Black people, and yes, most of these civil rights laws were ratified or put in place to protect Black people and their rights, former slaves. But now we're coming full cycle again, and hopefully you can begin to see that there is this cycle of oppression. And they're trying to undermine the 14th Amendment. And they kept fighting the battle against Black people, and they kept trying to hold the line with respect to the issue of voting. And so Congress put forth the 15th Amendment, which was the right to vote. That's what the 15th Amendment was, right? It gave Black people the right to vote. And then we went into this era where Black people were being elected to the United States Congress. The first Black person who ever sat in the Senate was not from Chicago, Illinois. It was not Carol Moseley Braun. It was not the senator from Connecticut. But it was a Black man named Hiram Revels, who I am somehow remotely related to, I found out most recently, from the great and grand state of Mississippi, Hiram Revels. And so Black people thought, well, wow, we have finally made it. We have finally overcome. But what they didn't contemplate, what they didn't account for, was that the white conservatives, particularly in the South, but not exclusively in the South, were not through fighting their battle, which was to continue to be our overlords, to continue to advance the false narrative that we are intellectually feeble, that we are in need of their care and their protection. So they continue to go into their little political factory and retool their arguments. And they began for the first time to formulate this notion of reverse discrimination. And they began to challenge the laws and the policies and the regulations that were put forth to protect Black people, not to give them advantage over anyone else, but to ensure that they would not be, that we, my ancestors, your ancestors, if you're a Black person in the United States, that your ancestors would not be at a disadvantage in society. But there were some white people then, and there's some white people now, that think that if they have to play on an even playing field, somehow that is an injury to them because they deserve to have every advantage at the expense of everyone else. That's how the white system, and again, I'm being very careful. I'm not talking about every white person. I'm talking about that system, that approach that came out of Europe and decided that it had the right to take over and to control, to dominate, to exploit, and to disadvantage every other group of people on the face of the earth. That system has not died. It has reinvented itself time and again. And now we're back to 1883. And they're making all of these same arguments, the same arguments that they're making right now, that white people are being told to file claims against their colleges and their universities and their places of employment. This is what the current Trump administration is encouraging white employees, white students, and others to file lawsuits that say that they've been discriminated against, that they've been subject to reverse discrimination, that DEI has injured them, taken from them. But this isn't new. This is my point. I was talking about 1880 in Ronald Reagan, but the civil rights cases happened 100 years before that. The argument was essentially the same. Back then, they were talking about, and the Supreme Court's decision used this particular term to refer to Black people, that the Supreme Court's decision, opinion, said that Black people, because of all the laws that have been passed to protect them, to make them whole, that's a legal term, that the government was treating them as the special favorites of the government. And that's a nice way of saying DEI, reverse discrimination, but that's what they said in 1883. Can you see that there is a cycle? And if you are not cognizant of history, of human behavior, of human practice, of European strategies, but then if you just come in and you look at a segment of time, it might appear to an uninformed, a person who's not completely familiar with history, it might appear that Black people are in fact getting special treatment. But I would say this, or one of the terms that was used in the 1980s is preference. But I would say preference begets preference, meaning the reason why Black people are getting some type of special treatment by the government now is because they receive negative treatment or special treatment or preference in the negative sense hundreds of years ago, decades ago, and most recently. So it's simply repairing the harm that was done by the government, by the state government, by the federal government. And the question I think is often asked, and I think it's fairly asked, well, when do we have to stop paying? Well, I don't know. When the harm is completely repaired. Has the harm that was caused by slavery, by segregation, by Black codes, by convict leasing, has that been completely eradicated? The answer to that question is clearly no. All right. It's clearly no. Have Black people got to the point where they are able to determine their political destiny, choose their leaders without having to fight to be able to vote? Or are there still shenanigans trying to water down Black districts, trying to prevent Black people from voting, trying to make sure that they can't use their school IDs and other forms of IDs? Whereas in certain communities where we know white people hunt and have fishing license, where fishing licenses are acceptable, but student IDs are not. These games have been played and are being played continuously. That's the point, which brings us back to Thomas Jefferson's quote, which was the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. I think on balance, if I'm trying to figure out if we, as we're having this conversation about what we's going to do, one of the things that we's going to do going forward is be vigilant. You know, it's kind of like racism and oppression and bigotry is like a malignancy, right? And you go in for the treatment. The treatment is DEI. The treatment is affirmative action. The treatment is the 13th Amendment. The treatment is the 14th Amendment. The treatment is the 15th Amendment. The treatment is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The treatment is the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The treatment is the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And we apply the medicine of public policy, of curative public policy, right, to the condition of white racism and bigotry, and in the parlance and in the language of the Bible, oppression. Let me say this. Why am I talking about oppression? Because if I'm looking at what's happening to Black people and brown people, the one thing that I would say is that racism and many other isms are just species or variants of oppression. The core issue is oppression from the biblical perspective, and we know where God stands on that. And I say that because some of the comments that I've seen from some of my Black brothers and sisters who are Christians is that if you're a Christian, our focus should be on Christ and preaching the gospel. Well, what I would say to someone who says that is, look, friend, thank you, number one, for your comment. Keep them coming. Number two, study the scriptures a little closer. I would commend to you, and now I'm going to put my glasses on and act like an old man, but I can't read this small print. Without my glasses, so I'm going to read this. This is I'm reading from a Bible that is referred to as the New King James Version. I'm reading from the one of the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, the first book of the New Testament, for you biblical scholars. And the context of the conversation that I'm about to reference and read is that the religious establishment is coming against Jesus, and Jesus begins to speak to the hypocrisy of what the Pharisees were doing. And in fact, he did in this particular passage of scriptures, Matthew chapter 23, refer to them as hypocrites. He talks about the fact that they lay rules and regulations on people that they themselves don't try to actually follow. He talks about the fact that they are very ceremonial and ritualistic, and sometimes religion is reduced to a system of rules and sacred observances, but you miss the heart of the matter. And that brings me to one of my favorite quotes for people who say, well, if you are reverend, then you need to be focused on spiritual things. And someone said that in one of the quotes related to one of our Malcolm posts. He said, I know Christ. Why does it always have to be about race? Well, friends, it don't always have to be about race, But in the United States of America, very often it is about race. And whether I like that reality or not, I cannot live, as my daughter says, in the 51st state. Do you know what the 51st state of America is? There's 50 states in the Union. The 51st state is the state of denial. I refuse to. There is no salvation. There is no hope. There's no path forward for us if we choose to live in the 51st state, which is a state of denial. We need to call a thing, whatever that thing is. But anyway, Jesus says to them, because they had a very narrow scope, a very narrow interpretation of what God was concerned about. And he invites them and he challenges them and he rebukes them. He says in verse 23 of chapter 23, so we're talking 23 and 23, if you want to read it at your leisure. He says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithes of a mint and anise and cunning, and you neglect the weightier matters of the law." He said, "Now, so it's great that you put money in the offering plate, but you are neglecting the weightier matters." And what I interpret that to mean is the most important stuff. Here's the most important stuff. What does he say? "But you neglect the weightier matters of the law, which is number one, justice and mercy and faith." That's Matthew chapter 23. Don't tell me that justice is not something that, as a man of faith, as people of faith, that God is not concerned about justice. Of course he is. He is a just God. And we are living in an unjust system. We can know that, an unholy system, a system that God is not pleased with, because God loves justice. And Jesus is not just an Old Testament thing. Jesus tells the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the scribes, who were the religious authority of his day, he told them, look, you need to learn about what's really important to God, and justice is right there. And see, oppression, as I said to you multiple times already, is offensive to God, because it frustrates and it cuts against and runs completely against the grain and is opposite of justice. I also said that as Christians, as people of faith, as people of goodwill, we have an affirmative duty to call injustice out whenever and wherever we see it. And right now, I would say this about the United States of America. If I am up 30,000 feet looking at the great historical picture, we are simply relapsing back into a system of oppression, a system that's built upon exploiting the many for the benefit of the few. Oh, that's how it's playing out in the United States of America, but it's played out that way throughout recorded human history. I do think that the beginning of our salvation is having some time of introspection and reflection, and then putting in structures, political, spiritual, economic, that will enable us to be self-sustaining and self-supporting. Let's get to Malcolm. This conversation is about Malcolm, I promise. So Malcolm, often when you hear Malcolm's quotes, the most common quote that you hear is "by any means necessary." But that quote is taken out of context, and it is unfairly characterized by the system as calling for violence. But Malcolm, and for that matter, the Nation of Islam, did not advocate gratuitous and proactive violence against anyone. In fact, the nation taught its members to respect the laws and really to have limited interaction with white people, for that matter. So there was nothing that was threatening to white people about what the Nation of Islam was about if the system was really trying to do what was fair. I think, and I'm not a Muslim. I was never a member of the Nation of Islam, and I'm not endorsing Nation of Islam. I'm not speaking for it or against it. What I think the system found most threatening about the Nation of Islam was that they were advocating independence and separation. And white people want segregation, which is we're going to live in separate places. We're going to look down our nose at that time. And still today, there are white people who feel that way, that they're superior to everyone, but not all. But they didn't want complete separation, because then who was going to cook their meals, right? Who was going to watch their children? Who was going to wash their clothes? Who was going to cut their yards? Who was going to, in some cases, nurse their babies? They didn't want complete separation. They wanted segregation. They wanted to be in a relationship with Black people, but they wanted to be in the superior position where Black people were beholden to them, where Black people adored them, where Black people saw them as right under God, right? Which is brings us to one of the comments that caused, our conversation to explode on TikTok. And Malcolm's quote is that white people love themselves so much that they're startled when they find out that their victims don't see them the same way and that don't hold them in the same high regard. I got a lot of comments on that. And some people say, well, they don't really love themselves. They are what's the word? Insecure. And they're hoping that we could make them feel better about themselves. I think that the way that the system socializes white people, the European structure that I talked about that was put in place hundreds of years ago when white people decided that they were going to leave their little small piece of the earth. And you think about Europe, Western Europe, it's very, very tiny. They're going to expand out and take over the world. They're going to go as far as China and subjugate the Chinese people. They're going to go to Japan. They're going to go to the hintermost parts of Africa, down to South Africa. They're going to go west. Wherever they went, they didn't, initially sometimes they act like they wanted to collaborate. They wanted to trade, but ultimately and I think what they did in India is just a classical example of how the British and Europeans, the model that they use, to come in and we trade, and then eventually we take over and we subjugate. And then the last thing that they want to do is to make you worship them, idolize them, love them. You can't oppress me and think that and then demand that I love you. I won't. It's inhuman for someone to love someone who is actively trying to destroy them. Now, let's talk about that, because I think that one of the persons said, one of the comments were, as Christians, aren't we supposed to love our enemies? Well, we can love the people and hate oppression, right? We can love individuals and hate the system of oppression and disdain and work to overthrow the system, not government. I'm talking about revolution. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about overthrowing the system of oppression, which exists not just in the air, but I'm talking about how we think about ourselves, number one, and how we think about other people. We can love the human beings, and we should love. And I've already told you before why we can't afford to hate anyone, because we, as human beings, we're scarce in terms of our resources, in terms of our time, in terms of our intellectual and emotional energy. We need to use our best and brightest minds to come up with strategies to lift us as a group. And if our best and brightest minds are always devoted to reacting and devoted to telling other people what they're doing wrong to us, and not planning and not demanding the right that they need to do, that we insist that they do, then we're going to always be in this reactionary posture. 100 years from now, our grandchildren, our great-great-grandchildren will be talking about how the cycle has continued on from the year 2025. So I want to make sure I'm clear about this. When we talk about overthrowing, we're talking about changing our thinking. Okay, be clear about that. Governments come and go, and the only ultimately God Himself, and Daniel in his book talks about this, chapter 2. It is God who lifts up governments, plants them, and it is God who brings them down. But how we view those that are in opposition to us, that's really where the battle is. How we talk about our struggle, that's where the battle is. That's where we have to revolutionize our thinking. We have to revolutionize our language. I think, and we're bringing this conversation to a close, if Malcolm was here today, he would tell us we're doing a not so good job about discussing our struggle. The one thing that Malcolm was very gifted at, it was articulating in very sharp and concise terms what the battle was about. He never called for violence. At one point, he felt that he couldn't collaborate with white people, or he shouldn't. But I started to tell you the story, and I'll come back and finish it, where the white girl who came to him and said, "What can I do?" And he said, "Nothing." He did say later in his life that he regretted that. For those of you who have said to me, "Why are you always talking black and brown?" Because here's the thing, the path forward for us is collaboration, cooperation, being on a team of people who have a like mind, who have like struggle. You may have heard the term or the statement, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." If we are being oppressed by the same oppressor, it makes sense that we, to some degree, find a way to work together. People who have changed the world have not been averse to working with people who are not in their narrow specific group. It's not me, my four, no more. One way that we lift our discrete and specific group is by finding people that we can work with. You know, many hands make light work. We've got to build collaborations to lift ourselves, and we've got to have some vision. We have to ascend to 30,000 feet, and that's a metaphoric place. That's the first thing that we've got to do. And I would say now, as a man of faith, you know, and I think that our African ancestors would say this: we've got to turn our hearts and minds to God. Maybe you can't hear that, maybe you can't receive that, but if you can, please receive it, because He's the Alpha, the Omega, the beginning and the end. He has all the answers. We have none of the answers. We've tried different things. I've started out talking about that metaphor about cancer and the treatment. We treated the malignancy. We reduced the tumor to a small pea size, but then we walked away and we began to celebrate. We began to declare that the battle was done, but the cancer was still there. And so it resurged with a vengeance. And right now, this malignancy of intolerance, of bigotry, of hypocrisy as it relates to calling DEI reverse discrimination, calling it an injury or characterizing it as somehow being a harm to white people, inviting white people who are not otherwise thinking in those terms to file lawsuits against colleges and universities so that they can make a political point and so that they can achieve a political goal, which is to weaken and to water the policy that was put in place to help black people, and yes, brown people, but initially, historically, it's correct, black people. Folks, we got to do some thinking about what's going on. And I would say, as a man of faith, we got to do some praying about it. Now, Malcolm, one of the things that he did in his early life, he was not a spiritual man. If you know his autobiography, he was a very secular man, but he had a rough childhood, and that's stating it mildly. But he was evolving. That's the title of this conversation tonight. He was evolving. He was learning, he was growing, he was expanding spiritually, emotionally, intellectually, but he did have a spiritual root. And in that way, he was similar to Dr. King. The one thing that they had in common is that they understood that a movement, an effort to lift an entire group of people, was beyond the realm of secular ability. And therefore, there was a need for divine help, divine assistance. And guess what? There's still a need. There's an urgent need for divine help and divine assistance. And so as we begin to contemplate not how we're going to respond, we don't need to respond to what Trump administration is doing, the current attack on DEI, because we know that there's a spirit and an attitude behind that. And the current mask that it's wearing is anti-DEI, but that monster has been around forever. How are we going to neutralize that monster once and for all? That's the question. The system that keeps pushing back, the system that continues to insist that it have a superior position in the world above all other people. That is what we have to think about, pray about, reflect. Hey, folks, hopefully you might have found something that I said today inspirational, hopeful, motivational. I do intend to speak again. I speak as a minister of the gospel, first and foremost. And the words that I speak are heavily influenced, if not entirely influenced, by my faith. And I certainly speak as a student of history and as an observer of politics. We've got some thinking to do. We got to think before we act. We've got to pray and seek direction, and then we need to act in that order. Now, folks, I'll talk to you soon. If you want to holler at me on Facebook, YouTube, or TikTok, I'm waiting to hear from you. Until next time, we'll see you soon.